Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. E.
And I am Mortimer the Authenticator, and we have the Duality of Man.
Today, we're talking about shame and its place in society, if it at all has one. Now, Dalton, would you like to state your position first?
Um, you can go first.
All right. I believe that society needs a healthy, not like overbearing and crippling, but just a healthy amount of shame in order to maintain societal cohesion. There needs to be, like, say, a box, and at the center of the box is the thing that, like, basically everybody can agree upon. And as the box get wider, you get to, more further out, more differing opinions, more things on the fringe. And in my opinion, the box should be pretty damn large. Like, in my own personal box, you, my friend, would fit very well inside of it. But
Hmm.
there has to be an endpoint where we say, no, this behavior is totally unacceptable. And with some unacceptable behaviors, we mark those down as crimes. But of course, all unacceptable behavior isn't necessarily criminal. So, how are we going to deal with it? People should, feel ashamed when they do those things. So, like, they're not criminals, but they need to know that these things are unacceptable. And it's not just like, oh, I don't like these things. I'm talking about things that are outright detrimental and destructive to things, to our civilization.
Well, but here's the thing though. How many of those things that fit that mold shouldn't be crimes? Because if they're that destructive to require public censure, external shaming, which I'll get into why I phrased it as external shaming when I state my case. But the question I have is, should we not broaden the criminal code in such a case then, so that all of the things that warrant a shameful reaction are covered by law, and then we can view shaming, external shaming, for exactly what it is, which is a overbearing moralistic um freak out, and I guess this is where I get into my position. My
Yeah.
position is I am fine with shame as long as it's internal shame, i.e., you shouldn't be beholden to some external standard with that's we're all watching you in some kind of Rubicon sense, and if you put a toe beyond what we define as uh, normal or typical or unshameworthy, then we all gang up on you. We should be teaching people to develop their own internal sense of self-regulation, which, for the sake of this argument, I'm going to call internal shame. And the thing is, so many of and one of the reasons I'm against external shaming as much as I am is because so many of the men's rights issues that we face today are down to, at bottom, some kind of the woman has the moral high ground by default, and therefore society, at her behest, or at the behest of men who toady to the great female hive mind, um, will shame you. That is the main power that women have always held. They've always held the power of the moral pecking order, and oh my God, do they ever use it? Your entire manhood will be stripped away from you if you don't get laid enough, or get laid too often, or get laid under circumstances that we just generally don't prefer, or like, so much of the weapon that feminism has and gynocentrism has against men is the power of external societal shame, irrespective of the fact that most men actually do tend to have an internal self-regulating form of shame. Because here's the difference. Here's why I favor internal shame to external shame every single time. Because internal shame happens when a man fails to live up to his own standards, not the standards that society thinks he should abide by because reasons, not the standards that have been drilled into his head from early childhood. When a man has a self actualized sense of self, he can make his own rules and therefore is subject to its own or his own self regulative impulse of his own internal shame of I have failed to live up to my standards. And I think that is far more healthy than being beholden to everyone else's, usually in many ways contradictory and overblowing standards. The standards that we should care about are our own. Now, there is, of course, the issue of how does one acquire a sense of internal shame? And here's the counterintuitive rub, in my opinion. I don't think in I don't think external shame translates well to internal shame. External shame translates into negative self-talk, into tying yourself up in knots, into thinking you're not good enough, thinking you're not capable of exercising your own moral agency a lot of the time. And that's why I'm against external shame, because not only is external shame not bad for any number of reasons all by itself, but I view external shame as very often a impediment to the development of internal self-regulation that leads to a sense of internal shame when we are failing to live up to our own standards.
Now, there are a couple of things that I would really like to respond to. Uh, the, one of the things that you mentioned was if these things are going to be shamed, why shouldn't they be criminalized? Because there are certain things that you have the right to do, but there are things that you ought not to do. Now, you have the right to free speech. Now, now there are things that, well, you have the right to say them, like in a society, like when you have to interact with other people, there are just like certain things that even if you have the right to say them, things that you should not say. Can you? Because that's something that we could agree on.
I would have to ask for examples because I would think that things like libel, things like slander, those are the sorts of things that you have the judicial system for, that you have civil law for. Um, you don't again. I don't see the need for this like mass informal Rubicon where everyone is pointing a shame gun at everyone else at all times and in all circumstances,
I'm not
or
even talking about
potentially.
pointing the shame gun. I'm not talking about like a Game of Thrones Cersei march through the town square where everybody says shame and there's who. What I'm saying, what I'm suggesting is that we as a society, when somebody says a certain thing or performs a certain action, we the we reject not even necessarily the person, but the action that the person took. Like say somebody comes up and it's okay, like man, like I just like abandoned, my children. Like I just said, you know what, I'm just not going to deal with them anymore, and we should respond like, it's really fucked up, man.
Right, but that's not exactly shame necessarily. It lacks the invective that leads to shame, the emotion of shame. And
Yes, that's
that's
from one person, perhaps, but when everybody that you interact with like agrees that the action that you took is fucked up, like it's going to cause you to reflect
but
because
that's inevitably going to lead to the mass shunning thing that we just said was not good. And this is why I'm so shame skeptical, because once you introduce the possibility of external shame, there really is no way to stop the force you've unleashed. There is no way to prevent the shaming of incels, the shaming of people who were too fucking short, or people who were too fucking ugly, or people who, gosh darn it, just look creepy, or people who don't toady enough at the altar of gynocentrism. This is why I'm very shame skeptical, because
well, that's where
once you make societal shame or external shame something that is permissible, there is no way to put that genie back in the bottle. So I would rather just not have it.
Well, the thing is, that's where the idea of the box come from. Like, in order for people to, you know, publicly, or for people to, get shamed by, the rest of the public, it would have to be something like especially outside of the bounds of society. Like, people could have like different worldviews, different religions, even like engage in actions that people don't necessarily like, but for like external shame to essentially kick in, it has to be something that is just detrimental to basically all of society. Like, you are damaging society when you take
Okay,
something
but
like,
those things you can have at the very least civil law for. That it either shame is this negative force that it becomes impossible to stop, or shame is just an unnecessary middleman rubbing salt in a wound that's already being treated. That's why I say, like, the only purpose shame should have is in an internal sense. If a person fails by their own metric, they should feel ashamed within their own self. They should shame themselves. But it shouldn't be this weapon that society has to cudgel everyone to death when they have transgressed against whatever we decide the norm happens to be.
it's not even it's not even just the norm. It's so out of the it's just so out of the bounds is what I'm trying to say. And let me
Okay,
ask you,
but again, if
how,
it's that beyond the pale, why isn't it in the cadre of civil law or the cadre of criminal law, depending on just how far beyond the pale we're talking? Um, again, shame is either an an extra thing that rubs even more salt on a wound that's already had dirt thrown in it by the legal system, or it's it's thoroughly unnecessary, at least in the external sense. Internal shame is perfectly reasonable. When a person fails by their own metric, by all means, they should feel ashamed. And I find that kind of shame and that kind of self regulation to be nothing but constructive. But when you give that power over to other people, you end up in this perpetual Rubicon. And
well,
it
let me
ends
ask you
up being fearing for my social life at every interval because I might be shamed within an inch of the death of it.
well, here, well, let me ask you something. Like, how is somebody going to learn that this is an action that is wrong? This is an action that you should be ashamed of if there is no external mechanism. Like, for example, a child does not necessarily know what actions, should or should not be shameful. It's up to the parents to kind of like instill like a certain moral framework in them.
Yeah, but that's what they should do. They should instill a moral code, or better yet, create an environment that allows the child to develop that kind of sense on their own, which they will eventually develop on their own.
Well,
Which
yes, but a
which
child isn't
again,
necessarily going to like a child isn't going to, necessarily have a situation where he's going to be taught like every moral thing. Like, there's only so much a parent can teach a child before they go out and interact with the real world, and oftentimes people interact with the real world, and oftentimes in situations that they can't possibly predict.
which is why the old saying "it takes a village to raise a good baby" exists, because on some level we have to know that we are going to have children interacting with certain segments of the real world, and we can insulate them from that, and we can set it up in such a way that they will be protected insofar as they can be when dealing with it. But it shouldn't just be the parent's job to teach all the things. That's why we have a wider society. But I still don't think shame is a very good teaching tool. Shame is a good way to um, gain a bunch of mindless soldiers if it works well, or it's a good way to create mass bombers if it doesn't work well. Um, it just it's not worth. I maintain external shame is not a good way of teaching self-regulation. It gets in the way of developing that kind of internal sense of self-regulation.
Well, let me
Um,
ask. Well, let me ask you something, Dalton, because in today's society, it seems like we have an entire mass of people who appear to have no sense of shame at all, certainly no internal sense of shame. And it seems like the only time that they ever acknowledge that the action that they took were wrong or incorrect is when that they are is when shame is heaped upon them from the outside. If no shame was given to them from the outside, they would continue perfectly along with whatever destructive actions they were taking.
but the those people will end up bearing their own consequences.
Yes,
Is the
but
thing.
how much damage will they do to the rest of society while while they're waiting for their own inevitable destruction? Because here's the thing: like when someone acts completely without shame, like they don't exist in a vacuum. Their actions are going to affect other people in society that they have to interact with, and so just having someone who's operating with no sense of shame, no internal restriction on their actions, it's going to do God knows only how much damage.
Where it can be, it should be dealt by with civil law and or criminal law. Where it can't, it can often act um as a what do you call it? Cautionary tale was the word I was looking for the onlookers who see, look at how crazy that person is. I am going to act differently. But there's still no reason to then turn that around on them and go shame, shame, shame. It is a good reason to expedite consequences in their direction, and that would be my solution there. Like I think the old adage "fuck around and find out" is the best option in such circumstances of like, yeah, no, you will now bear the consequences of the shit you did. Um, and doing whatever we can to expedite those consequences, that's a different conversation. But I sort of approach it from let life itself be the teacher, and a lot of times what people can use to develop that internal sense of shame is seeing people like that are self-evident ruins of human beings and going, okay, clearly I need to accord myself differently and be a more respectable human being because otherwise, you know, cautionary tale example.
Well, one thing is, let me ask you, what do you think is a worse punishment? Having um, having people suffer external shame, or stripping them of their freedoms and locking them in a cell? Because I would argue that the criminal code is much harsher than just external shame, and I don't think that necessarily everything that people should be ashamed of is necessarily worthy of being locked in a cell or and having their
Well,
freedom.
if it's not bad enough to be criminalized or even subject to the the civil court, why is it the subject of shame to begin with?
because
That's my thinking of like,
because I think
if it's not bad enough to carry some kind of external consequence, then
it's
shame
damaging.
is still unnecessary at that point.
Because it's damaging to society. Can you do you agree that there are some things that, while being perfectly legal, are still damaging to society?
Yes, which means we should probably reevaluate the laws somewhat and or reevaluate what we exactly value about society.
But here's the thing: like, I don't think that we necessarily need more restrictive laws in order to curb that damaging behavior. Like, I don't think that like people. I think that something is bad enough that you should be ashamed of it, but not necessarily that you should be locked up for it.
Well, again, in those cases, I would normally espouse the let the consequences the person makes for themselves hang on themselves.
Yes, but how? Let
Um,
me ask you something, Dalton. What consequences would those be? Like
they
if nobody rejected their action and told them that they should be ashamed of themselves for doing this, what consequences would follow? Would they just,
usually
would the rest of society just interact with that person as normal?
not no one has any obligation to interact with anyone else necessarily. What the, but they don't then get to go, you should be ashamed of yourself. It because that in and of itself is an action. That's not abstaining from action. That's not abstaining from interaction. That is choosing to interact. Uh, it is choosing to interact with a person in an active way that is shaming. That and that and that never it never has any good consequence when someone is shamed. It's only ever either a salt in a wound that's already open, or insufficient to the task of actually dealing with a problem. And the only option, if you allow for shame, is okay, if it was insufficient to the action, maybe we should shame more. But then once you go, okay, maybe we should just shame them harder, then you wind up in the situation where, whoops, now everyone is at everyone else's moral gunpoint, and it it's not it's not a force to be toyed with. So I would just as soon leave it in the bottle and not have it be a thing in society. It's never led to anything good, and the list of things that it has led to that are bad are miles and centuries long. Not to mention most of the things currently afflicting the grouping of men in general. Most of the most of the men's rights violations that we currently have essentially boil down back to moral shaming, because women have the power of moral shaming, and incredibly feminine men usually have some level of power, at least in the modern day, of moral shaming. Hence, we wind up in a world where a man can be shamed out of a career, shamed out of his life, shamed out of everything that is his human dignity, because we just let the shame run rampant.
Now, let me
Now,
ask.
there's an argument to be made that we don't shame the correct people, and that's an argument to be made. But even then, all you're going to give the people who need to be shamed, if you shame them at this point, is victimhood points, which they will then use to give themselves moral legitimacy. And then they will turn it around on you, and then it will be an endless cycle of destructive shame, and nothing will ever become better, because we will not put the shame guns down ever. So let's just put them away already. They've never done anything good. They've done ludicrous numbers of things that are bad, and the current state of society is very much evidence of what happens when you let abstract moral shaming become the cause célèbre of the day. It never does anything good. It does 1,000 things bad, and yet we just simply will not put it the fuck away. I don't understand why.
Now, two things. One, you mentioned before that, if you feel that this person should be ashamed of something, rather than expressing the fact that they should be ashamed of it, you should just not interact with that person. But there are situations where you have no choice but to interact with people that you don't like, or people that you feel are, shameful or
Yeah.
unworthy of
At
respect at
which
the
at
same
which
level.
point you should at which point you should minimize interacting with them as much as possible.
Yeah, but sometimes that's not always possible. And two, oh god, I had a great point in my head for two, and it just disappeared. Fuck.
It happens.
Trying to get it back. Trying to get it back.
Take your time.
Okay, so what are, one of the problems with today's society is that people are being shamed. The thing is that a lot of the things people are being shamed for are, in reality, perfectly healthy, normal human interactions. Like
Or
a guy,
even virtues, depending.
yes, like a guy would, let's say, walk up to a woman and try and talk to her. Maybe he's interested in asking her on a date, and then the woman would videotape it, post it online. The guy would get shamed. Like, I'm not talking about things that everybody, like the vast majority of people would agree is just a normal interaction. And again, in today's society, it really is like an extreme, an extremely vocal minority of people who are shaming like these normal interactions that are getting men like canceled and caught up. What I'm talking
Beaten
about
within
is
an inch of their social lives,
yes,
if not their actual lives.
yes. The thing that I'm talking about are the things that like 99.9% of society would reject. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about like normal human interactions, and I'm not talking about people's own individual moral interpretations. I'm talking about things that, as a society, we reject, like things that like the liberal atheist and the Christian would look at that thing and both agree, no.
Yeah, but then again, who decides, and most importantly, who decides when shame is not permissible? Because that's the thing, is when you introduce shame into a system, unless you put a very hard line, no shame beyond this point, then shame will weasel its way into as many facets of society as we can manage. And at that point, you're living either in the Pleasantville slash Stepford style dystopia, or you're living in a Muslim theocracy somewhere. So it's like the issue I have with shame is it's one of the darkest human tendencies, the 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 ability of abstract moral shaming. And unless you are very, very strict in your terms of no shame beyond this point, it will spread like wildfire, and it will become everyone putting on a placid Stepford smile to hide the moral gun that has been placed at everyone's back. It will be, how dare you use the old speak when we've already updated to the new speak. And it happens just as easily in traditionalist theocracies as it does in the neo-Hegelian nightmare that we all are currently living in the modern day Western world. So at some point, I think the most sensible option is put down the shame, put down the gun. It's not helping.
I think that one of the things that has led our society to where we are now is the fact that people were constantly being told that um, that you shouldn't be ashamed of this. You shouldn't be ashamed of this is no action. Now, obviously, yes.
Only if they toe the ideological line, though, and
Here's
that's
the,
how it's always been in every society.
like
People who definitely deserved to be morally shamed, or arguably could have deserved to be morally shamed, get away with it because they do what they do with the aegis and the permission of whatever the moral zeitgeist happens to be, whether it's traditionalist Christianity, whether it's fundamentalist Islam, whether it's social justice, whether, the only way that people get away from being shamed who deserve it, or who would deserve it, is by kowtowing to the societal moral zeitgeist. And meanwhile, people who have done literally nothing wrong get beaten the shit out of them because they are transgressing the moral framework of the day, whether it's traditionalist Christianity, whether it's fundamentalist Islam, whether it's social justice. So at some point, I think it would be safer for everyone if we just put the prospect of public shaming away.
this, but what I'm talking about is a solid, very wide and encompassing moral framework, not one that's made out of Swiss cheese.
Yeah, and I and
And
I and I and I
and
believe that you have a line by which no shame beyond this point. But here's the rub: how do we get everyone to agree no shame beyond this point?
well, the thing is, like,
Do we then shame the shamers? Because that would be my solution to this. If we must have a society with shame in it, which again, I still question whether we need one. But if we must have shame in our society, and external shame, societal shame in our society in any meaningful way, can we then turn around and when someone uses that shame too much or takes it too far, when they take it beyond the point we've all agreed to, can we then shame the shamers? Can we mock them? Can we be irreverent towards them? And that's the thing. No, one of the freedoms that I hold dearest to my heart is the virtue of irreverence. And it boggles the mind that there is going to be a society that both allows for moralistic shame and allows for mocking those who shame too much. And
I would
it's
absolutely
it
be I would absolutely be at the part of that, and I think that you know that I would as well. And
yes, but here's the problem. I trust you with this power, but I can't trust everyone else in our shared society with that kind of power, and some people will misuse it. And if those people who misuse it are as believed or even partially as believed as the people who use this hypothetical ability to shame correctly, then we wind up in the tyranny of the gynocentric slash feminist paradigm, because it is always women more so than men. I wish it weren't that way, but it is that way. It is always women more so than men who have the reins of the moral pecking order and therefore control the threshold of shame.
well, I wouldn't necessarily say that men had no control over the reins of shame because
No, and that's why I said more. Women have more of the lion's share of the threshold of shame. Not
now
saying
I
no man
recognize
has ever, but yeah, but
I think one of the reasons why women are currently swinging the sides of shame as much as they are is because I think one of the most institutional, one of the most crucial factors for forming a solid moral framework that is able to, work in cohesion with the rest of society is something like the family, which we both agreed has been
yeah,
broken.
the family as it existed n minus several cycles ago.
And believe me, I am well aware that short of a wish on the freaking Dragon Balls, like this, um, there's no way to just turn this situation around in the next few years. Like in order to build the society that I'm talking about, it would literally require generations.
Yes,
I
and
I recognize that, but I also believe that it would be a better society than what we have now.
granted that threshold isn't exactly hard to reach at this point. Well, we're marching ever so steadily towards the dystopia of 1,000 paper cuts, but yeah, I and again, I hope to God that such a society will come about. But until then, until everyone can calm the fuck down and we can all have a sane conversation again, um, I am very dangerous about encouraging. I am very skeptical and very leery of encouraging shame, because in many ways shame is at least part of how we got here in the first place, and it's part of why so many slights against men as a whole continue and will continue unabated for the foreseeable future, because not a real man, not a good enough provider. It like I remember a video. It was a based fizz video where he was reacting to a video where a man um and a woman were running away from a charging bear, and the man ran faster than the woman and didn't then go back to protect his protect his woman. And
whether just
Land
women
sakes
or whether just
alive, where
shaming.
there's so many people in the comments going, that man should be ashamed. Real men, da 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 da. He's not a real man. Men don't protect you anymore. Blah 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 blah. And it's like, you want the man to stand there and fight with a bear, do you? Okay, because otherwise, not a real man. Apparently, that's where we are now.
Now, I don't believe that any person is obligated, unless they sign up for something like necessarily military service, in order to risk their lives for someone else. However, I believe that most men would for the woman they love willingly do that, like of their own volition.
Yeah, yeah, but still, the man isn't less of a man because he saw a bear and went, "Oh shit."
Yeah, but there's something that you mentioned before regarding shaming the shamers, and this is something that I just remembered. But like as we mentioned before, like there are women who will like you know dress up in like skin tight like gym wear, and then wait for a guy to like walk past for like 3 seconds and then film them and try and blast them online. Now you mentioned people shaming the shamers. There are people online who go out of their way to shame people who do this. In fact, one of the most well known and well beloved is a guy called Joey Swole, and he became
Mhm.
famous for calling out that kind of insensitive, toxic behavior. So I absolutely like. I believe that this is a good use of, in my opinion, external shame in society, because this clearly destructive and oftentimes, I believe, malicious behavior, like, is now starting to be rejected by society because people are calling out and shaming it, whereas in like years prior, most people would just cower in fear.
Because oh, she's a woman, she can clearly do no wrong. Kind of centrist bullshit.
I think one of the reasons um I think one of the things about external shame is that, in a way, like, it allows people to, basically take that first step into, you know, building a culture where such things do not occur. Like, if people didn't like have the guts to shame like these like gym girls for doing this, it would most likely just continue unabated.
Yeah, and it's probably going to continue unabated regardless because the
But
woman
like there
card is
are
a
a lot
very
of
powerful narrative artifact.
I disagree, because there are actually a lot of gyms out there who are starting to say no cameras, because a lot of people are engaging in this behavior and people have begun to call it out. So people are just saying, you know what, no, you cannot, film here for your stupid social media videos, and you're not going to be, putting people on blast. And like I said, Joey Swole has become, much beloved on the internet for sticking up for people and calling out and shaming these kinds of toxic individuals.
And all the more power to him as far as I'm concerned. I just I worry because honestly, that is the best use of shame, in my opinion, to shame those who would shame you for an endless series of histrionic moral reasons. But what happens when those people who what happens when the people shaming the shamers have no shamers left to shame? Will they then be the people in charge of the society, and in so doing, will they be the ones initiating the shame? In which case, we may very well wind up right back here in a generation or two. And again, it's just one of those things of like, yes, I enjoy shaming people who are too uppity and moralistic myself. It's again, I consider irreverence to be a virtue, but all too often you see people who use their weapons justly when they have no power all of a sudden forget how the fuck that works when they have the power, when they are the ones with the moral upper hand in society. And
I
I
feel like
worry about that.
I feel like if that were to occur and people who are wielding the weapon were to you know go out of control, well, the thing is, it's the weapon that everybody has. So, like, if you go out of your way and start shaming people for like utterly innocuous things, like in the gyms, like people will come up and start saying, "No, you should be ashamed for doing this." Once
Yeah,
when
I
someone gets out of control with it, other people rise up and put them.
like when Matt Walsh called anime satanic, and basically his entire audience went up yours.
Yeah, and now another example of, I think, a place where external shame is totally valid. Like, okay, now I'm sure you're aware of the situation in a lot of schools where a teacher will just go off the walls with like either teaching like explicit like sexual material to like second graders, or they will just be go or they will just try to like indoctrinate them into certain ideological thinking, and
Or
they will
the
do.
grooming behavior that happens in a lot of LGBT clubs where a teacher will literally look for the misfits of the class and then go, "Oh, your misfitness, it's from some kind of gender dysphoria and therefore trans
Yeah,
kids."
and the thing is, they go out of their way to make sure that other people, specifically parents, do not find out about this kind of thing. And when parents do find out, I feel the parents are perfectly within their right to heap shame upon the people who are doing this to their children and trying to keep it a secret.
Hmm. I again, it's just shame is such a dangerous weapon that it it's like with any other weapon, you have to be very, very careful in how you use it. And I worry that as time goes by and as the political situation shifts into into a position that you and I would consider more sane or more sane, is that weapon going to wind up being misused? And if so, if it's a shame that if it's a shaming that everyone has come to agree with, how do you stop it? How do you stop people from bullying the person who is correct, but also abnormal, atypical, beyond the pale of what society deems if society does indeed start trending more conservative? Because I don't want to have to go through the satanic panic again. Like we beat the satanic panic once back in the 90s, and yay, long may it burn the pits of hell. But um, very ironically indeed. And I hope to God we beat the SJWs, but I don't want to beat the SJWs with the kind of traditionalism that will inevitably beat us back into another satanic panic. I don't want this to be an endless cycle of 20 years of TradCon, 20 years of SJW, 20 years of TradCon, 20 years of SJW. We have to become a society that honestly considers moralism to be in and of itself shameful. To
I don't think that we are. I honestly don't think that we're going to go back to that situation, because I think that rightfully society and we, the people, have learned, just like I have no fear of things going back to slavery, because we as a society have learned that no, that's just wrong and
yeah,
unacceptable. I mean, like, dude, there are Christian D&D groups. Like
yeah,
one of the most beloved gaming franchises out there was Darksiders, where you literally play as the Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
yeah, and
Um, there's
and
Devil May Cry, where you play as literally a half demon. Like the Satanic Panic is I think well and truly dead and buried.
well, and but there are still the occasional Matt Walshes or Gavin McGinnis's or even sometimes the Lotus Eaters will go that way.
Well,
Largely Harry more so than the rest of them, but
okay, those
and
people are never going to gain any traction. They're going to be stuck running in place with that idea, basically ad infinitum.
I hope so, but I will maintain my vigilance and I will maintain the soul of a Kekistani, to call back to a meme from 2017, because I don't want to see I don't want it to be the king is dead, long live the king. I, like any red blooded American, want to live in a society with no kings, thank you very much.
Well, this is actually a comparison that I just came up with in the course of this conversation. Like, my opinion on shame is basically the same as like the conservative opinion on guns. An armed society is a polite society, and now I'm not now obviously most people, even if they do have a weapon, are never going to point it at someone unnecessarily.
Hmm.
But I feel like if someone were to jump off and start causing harm, the
Yeah,
people around them
it's
would be
better for it's better to have an armed populace than a non-armed populace, which I can see where you're going. It's just it I feel like we have gun safety courses for a reason. We don't teach philosophy, for example, in public schools, so we don't really have a philosophically armed populace. Um,
well,
or
let me ask you this.
at least we haven't taught people how to use the weapon that is shame responsibly, and that is part of the problem.
Let me ask you something. Do you think a nation should have a moral framework?
E, it depends on the moral framework, because I think we can all agree that theocracies or secular theocracies, like what we're kind of turning into now, are no goes. It's better for society to be pluralistic and allow for multiple different ideologies to flourish within a nation at the same time.
Yeah, I, I'm not opposed to that, but I feel like part of a national identity is like what we believe to be good and bad, like as a people. Like obviously, there are certain behaviors that are completely acceptable in one society that are absolutely unthinkable in another.
Hmm.
And so,
And of course, one of the smartest things our forefathers did was to create a separation of church and state. I wish they had foreseen just a little bit ahead and realized that the separation of state and ideology probably would have been a better edict, because just because an ideology wraps itself in the trappings of the scientific and the secular does not mean it it is prevented from being moralistic and authoritarian. Cough, cough. Everything that goes on in our society. Cough.
I wish I could go back and talk to the founding fathers. I know they probably wouldn't listen to me because I'm black, and that would be like the 18th century. But I would just be like, okay, listen, I just need 10 minutes alone with the Constitution. Just 10 minutes, and trust me, it'll be fine. It'll be better than fine.
Like long enough to change the word shall respect yeah, change the clause for respecting no establishment of religion to expect respecting no establishment of an ideology. That would literally, like, all the things we are currently dealing with would
And
be
in,
null.
and in parentheses, just to put a point on it, no communism.
And
Establishing
the
religion,
founders would be like, "What is this communism thing?" And they'd be like, "Oh,
just trust me,
it's a
just leave
thing
it
that will
in.
happen in the next 50 years or so. Trust me, definitely no, just no."
And like, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. No, seriously, we mean it. Hands off.
If you make a law that infringes this, then we will gut you. Like, just just to be clear, this society has cannons that you can own personally if you want. So don't let anyone ever tell you no musket or nothing but a musket. Like that floors me every time the but the founders only meant the things they had at the time. Oh, you mean when people could publicly own Gatling guns and cannons?
Yeah, and there were multi-shot guns. They weren't like they were today, and they were basically all
Well,
fired.
yeah, because Samuel Colt was a genius and completely revolutionized the system. But there were still it was a technology in its infancy to have multi-shot guns. And again, need I remind you that this was a society where if you wanted to take a cannon off of a ship and put it on your porch instead and aim it at anyone who transgressed your property, you were allowed to. And that's what I always say whenever I run into the. But they just meant muskets and what they had at the time, obviously. And I'm like, they allowed for the personal ownership of cannons and Gatling guns. End of conversation.
Like you could have barrels of gunpowder in your basement, which is essentially just a bomb without a fuse.
Yeah, or a really catastrophic fire should bad things happen, as they occasionally did. But oh well.
But let me let me ask you something. Like, do you think now, a lot of the ideological actors in our society are basically doing basically pushing their ideological agendas at the cost and flagrantly in the face of, but oftentimes, what is objectively and logically good for society and often against the will of the people. Should those people be shamed?
Again, as someone who firmly believes in the virtue of irreverence, which is a very counterintuitive virtue, I think, for a lot of people, but yes, I firmly believe in the virtue of irreverence, and therefore, if I were, if I were left alone with the Constitution for 10 minutes back in the day, I would have gone, "Praise be unto the trolls," because the, again, I still consider myself an ethnic Kekistani a la 2017. So yes, I'm fully in favor of trolling the shit out of moralistic pompous pricks, but still, like it's one of those, you have to use this weapon very responsibly, because if not, you will ruin the good art of trolling for everyone else if you do not troll responsibly.
I would absolutely be in favor of making sure that that this kind of thing is used responsibly. But like I mentioned before, like the people who are pushing these, you know, ideological ideas, like we can see the damage that they are doing to society. We can see that they even do not achieve the stated goals that were
Also,
initially
very
laid out.
often they're doing damage to themselves right along with the rest of society, which to me is the ultimate um deciding factor whether something should be shamed, if we're allowing for shame or not. It's not just that you're hurting my society, because that can get very authoritarian, the rhetoric of we're doing what we're doing for the greater good of society thing. um I maintain that truly bad things have bad consequences at no matter which level of magnification you're doing them at, whether it's on a one person to one person level or whether it's on a societal level, because the truly horrendous things in this world very often carry their own consequence. It's an automatic fuck around and find out. And yet, so many people fuck around and are surprised when they inevitably end up finding out. But oh well.
I
I
mean,
played with matches in a I played with matches in a fireworks factory. Who could have seen the massive explosion that inevitably happens after that coming? Literally everyone. Literally everyone who has ever seen a firework be lit.
I agree that there are actions that have natural consequences, but I also agree that, but I also believe that that in certain things, that if we as people who live in society don't act, there won't be any consequences, and things will just um, continue to get worse. Like for example, like there are certain things that are legal and that we put people in jail for it, that if we did not, as a society, decide that this is an offense worthy of criminality, they people would just continue to go on and do it without
Mhm.
really any consequence befalling them.
Until they inevitably destroy themselves. But by then it will probably be too late.
I think, well, there are some things that, if they weren't necessarily illegal, people would continue to abuse them. And I think that after a certain point, um, like they would cross the wrong person where they would that person just might have just end them. But I don't
Yeah.
think. But obviously, that would be wrong. That would also be wrong into itself, which is why we criminalize it. Also, not just because what they're doing is wrong, but also to give the person who is victimized some other recompense other than just necessarily taking it in their own hands to like a violent end.
Hmm.
Because I think one of the things that causes violence in our society is when people have been wronged, and you can and we can everybody who looks around can see that they've been wronged, but there is no legal recourse.
Recompense to pay for them, yeah.
So in that situation where someone has been undeniably hurt and sometimes very, very deeply, but there's no legal
Yeah, the
recourse
school
for them.
shooter effect, for example.
Would you say?
I said the school shooter effect. It's always the bullied weird kid in the class that winds up becoming the school shooter. Why? Because they were bullied repeatedly and without surcease for a long ass time and nobody gave two shits.
I feel like that's less of the case than there being no recourse, and that there is a system in place to deal with it, and that system just failing.
Yeah, yeah, but that means we need to make that system better because I, I'm sorry, but a system that fails that regularly for as regularly as we have school shooters and things, um, we probably need to tighten some bolts in this system here because it's clearly letting way too many people slip through the cracks.
Perhaps, perhaps we should, look at the individuals who, were in a position to do something for that individual and failed them, and say, hey, like you could have done this. Like this person was suffering. You were in a position to do something about it, and you just didn't. You should be ashamed of yourself for not doing something about it when you
Well,
had the
not only that should they be ashamed. I almost think that we should, especially if they're in a position of authority where they're by their very nature required to do so, like teachers and stuff. Honestly, if that happens, and not only were you in a position to do it, but you didn't, but it's honestly something that's kind of implicit in your job, you should lose your job at that point. I'm sorry, but like we have no use for teachers who see kids getting bullied and then don't proceed to try and do anything because
or
otherwise
worse,
school shooter and nobody is happy with the school shooter ending. It's the
or
worst
worse,
ending in the video game we call life,
yeah. Or
or
worse.
one of the worst endings.
I've seen stories of teachers actually like fostering the bullying, because oftentimes, like, say you have one of these ideological teachers and the student says something.
Oh yeah, no, you should be fined. Like not just lose your job, but you should be fined and possibly thrown in prison at that point.
Like, did you see that video of those of that? I think it was like an audio recording, but this teacher was basically yelling at these two girls for saying that there are only two genders. Like just getting up in their face and basically yelling at them, like interrupting the entire class, the entire lesson, just to yell at these two girls.
Immediately losing your job is what that would be in a sane universe. But alas, we don't live in a sane universe. We live in a clown world that is slowly devolving into the dystopia of a thousand paper cuts. So there are a lot of people who have ideological motives that probably don't deserve the jobs they are currently in and are actively making everything worse by being in that job. Like teachers, people in the arts, the journo class. I think the entire journo class needs to be liquidated. I think
I mean, it's being slowly dismantled if you see what's going on.
because the ever based AI is slowly replacing everyone.
Speaking of AI, did you see that controversy with Sports Illustrated?
What now?
They were caught creating fake, life profiles for AI generated content. Like they were creating these like backgrounds for these fictional reporters that were actually AI generated articles.
You can't make this kind of shit up, folks. You really can't.
Yeah, like it's one thing like to say that it's generated by AI, but to go so far as to like create a fake reporter to then attach to the AI article and like actually like give him like a fake background and everything, like that's just ridiculous. And you should be and
Like,
like
just admit you were using AI. No one will think the less of you.
I think
We,
some
we
people will actually think the less of them for doing that.
I mean, if it's a choice between the AI and the average journo, I will take the AI.
I mean, true, but
Because as we know, the class of journalist is completely different from the class of journo.
I mean, there is the discussion that can you truly trust the accuracy and authenticity of something that was AI generated? Like my argument is that we might not be able to trust the article that the AI writes. We know we can't trust you assholes.
Yeah, it's like the AI fails because it doesn't know any better. You are explicitly ideologically motivated and hate your readership, so you can fuck right off. You're that special blend of both incompetent and miserable that makes you less preferable than the AI overlords. Because if you were just incompetent but you didn't actively spite your audience, people would probably still side with you on a general like hoorah humanity basis. But you're both bad at your job and spiteful about it, which makes the AI preferable to you. You have officially spited yourself out of a job because you actually made the Skynet option the more appealing option. It's actually it would be impressive if you were doing it intentionally, but you're not doing it intentionally. You're just that stupid.
And, it's, and especially when people like in the alternative media, like especially on X where you have things like community notes where like they will like actively like in real time prove that what you're saying is bullshit. Like why should anybody be interested in any of these publications?
Yeah, yeah. The power of the online autist. 4chan taught us well. The power of the online autist is better than almost any supercomputer.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts about our discussion on shame?
Um, I guess I've softened on it a little bit because there are obviously we've gone through examples where shame might have a use. I'm still not exactly comfortable with it. It's like any other weapon. I I respect it too much to ever enjoy it, really, because someone who enjoys firing a weapon too much is not exactly someone you want anywhere near you. But I I softened my position slightly in that there are very specific circumstances where I think shame is useful, but do not let it grow beyond those circumstances, please. Please,
Okay.
and on the other end of it, please troll responsibly.
but I
That's
also
that's that's one of the 10 Commandments of Keck. Thou shalt troll responsibly.
I also believe that it's something that should be used responsibly, and there should be no joy taken out of it. In fact, I think taking joy out of shaming other people is something that you should be ashamed of.
Yes.
But I
As
also
as with so many questions, the question we're left with is who shames the shamers.
I forget what the name of it was, but there was this story about is a story about King Arthur, and in the version of Excalibur that they had, it had on two sides of the sword, one that said "Pick me up," and the other side that said "Cast me away." That said,
Hmm.
"When you need me, pick me up. When you don't need me, cast me away." And that's exactly what um, shame at least should be. It shouldn't be a weapon that's used all the time for everything.
And you shouldn't have it. You shouldn't have that sword hanging in its scabbard on your belt, waiting for any old excuse to withdraw it.
All right, everybody. I've been Mystery.
I've been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we have been the Duality of Man. Roll responsibly, ladies and gentlemen.
Bye, everybody.